But thank you so much. I love the communal spirit of Portland already. It's very beautifully done. There's a problem in Oregon. There's a very inflated ego in this state. Wherever I travel, I ask, "Who are you?" And they respond, "I'm super." Took me a little while to realize that was an acronym and not a self-description. Because, frankly, so far as I could discern, I didn't see anything super cross my path. No offense intended. Don't want to deflate your egos or puncture them. This seems to be pretty much a college town. Am I right about that? No? What kind of town is it?
A super town.
Because I saw more than a fair share of young people walking in the streets. So it looked like it was a college town, like Boston. But I'm mistaken on that point? Yeah. And what's the main industry here?
Marijuana.
It's marijuana?
Nike and
Nike, sportswear.
Columbia Sportswear.
And Nike, do they have factories here or no?
HQ is here, the headquarters.
Yeah, but the factories, I assume, are in China.
Music and art.
Music and art? In Portland? Let's see, any famous music or artistic people? Was Whitney Houston from Oregon? Beyonce? Judy Garland? Michael Jackson?
John Reed.
John Reed.
Ursula Le Guin.
Who?
Ursula Le Guin.
Oh, yes, Ursula Le Guin. John Reed is better for me. So, who else?
Esmeralda Spalding.
Who?
Jazz bassist and singer.
Ernest Bloch? I don't want to break this to you folks, but outside of Oregon, nobody's heard of these people. Which I suspect is going to deflate your ego even more. Well, thank you for having me tonight. And I've been giving several talks in the past day and a half, and I try to accommodate my host who has been taking me from one venue to the next. And I accommodate him by not repeating myself and trying to speak on a slightly different topic wherever I show up. And tonight, I'll deal with the topic which is actually on the posters, namely, do the Israeli snipers on the perimeter of Gaza, do they have a right to self-defense, as would seem to be the case, judging by what human rights organizations have been reporting and analyzing. I will also, at the end of my remarks, I will look at the most recent developments, which I think are not terminal, but they are ominous, and they will mark another setback in the efforts to achieve justice in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think things are headed in a negative direction, but I don't think it's irreversible, and I'll get to that at the end of my presentation. So, I know I have a very formidable challenge this evening, because there's a young woman who I estimate at 7 years old, sitting in the second row, who has very high standards, exacting standards, demanding standards of excellence, and I'm going to have to sustain your interest, young lady, because I don't want to see you be taking out some iPad and watching some cartoon at my expense, because I did not travel all the way from New York City to have my ego punctured in, of all places, Portland, Oregon, which the best it can show for itself is something named Ernest Bloch, who I think we can all agree is not a Van Gogh. Since March 30th of last year, there have been ongoing demonstrations in Gaza to try fundamentally to lift the siege of Gaza, the blockade that's been imposed on it. There is a certain amount of ambiguity in the demands of the people of Gaza. It began as a demonstration to recall for the world the right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes from 1948. However, at a certain point, several weeks into the demonstrations, the focus turned to trying to lift the blockade of Gaza. And the demonstrations have been unusually disciplined, courageous, and protracted. Some of you may recall, if you follow the developments there closely, the original expectation was they would last approximately 6 weeks. They would go from March 30th, which is called Land Day in that part of the world, until May 15th, which is the day marking the expulsion of the Palestinian population from its homeland. But it soon became apparent to the people of Gaza that you have to be in for the long haul. This was a very difficult nut to crack, and that it's going to take much longer than 6 weeks. I actually was quite optimistic at the beginning, but something didn't happen which I expected would happen, and that changed the calculus. As you know, or most of you in the room presumably know, there's always this talk, in particular on the social media, about when is there going to be the third intifada? When is there going to be the third intifada, the third revolt against the Israeli occupation? And lo and behold, before our eyes, the third intifada burst on the scenes in the form of the mass, overwhelmingly nonviolent resistance in Gaza, of a kind that's particularly heroic and courageous, because on each Friday, the climax being Friday, May 14th, these overwhelmingly nonviolent resistors were being mowed down by the Israeli snipers. And you might have expected, you might have thought that the solidarity movement would immediately start holding demonstrations and mass nonviolent civil resistance in the various venues where they are concentrated in support of the people of Gaza. But it didn't happen. And the people of Gaza, as I said, it was quite a sobering shock to me. The people of Gaza were abandoned, forsaken, left to their own devices, and abandoned, forsaken, left to their own devices, of course, they cannot win. That's impossible. Israel will finally either erode their will or drive them to resume what's called armed resistance. And for the life of me, it's kind of unfathomable. I just don't quite get why this solidarity movement seems to think whether or not Madonna performs in Tel Aviv is of more significance and importance than lending a hand, lending support to the people of Gaza in their moment of truth. Be that as it may, it's now about 1 year and 2 months since the demonstrations began, and they keep going. They keep coming out. They keep getting killed with less and less media attention. It's now lasted longer, for those of you who have a historical memory. These demonstrations have now lasted longer than the Montgomery bus boycott, which was almost exactly a year in the making before the city finally capitulated. The international community has strongly condemned Israel's armed response to these overwhelmingly nonviolent demonstrations. Almost immediately, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution deploring the use of any excessive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. The day, or I should say approximately a week or two after the peak of the Israeli brutality in Gaza, Human Rights Watch issued what was really a quite excellent report. And it said that Israeli forces' repeated use of lethal force in the Gaza Strip against demonstrators who posed no imminent threat to life may amount to war crimes. The climax, the culmination of these human rights condemnations came about a month or two ago when the UN Human Rights Council, a 3-member commission, issued a really very professional, authoritative, serious report on the situation in Gaza. I had followed the developments fairly closely, but I must say I was much illuminated by what was in that report. There was a lot of material in there, and I will return to that towards the end of my remarks. The question, however, I want to pose today is, even if it's acknowledged that the condemnations of Israeli conduct have been welcome, the question nonetheless remains whether these condemnations have gone far enough. The question I would put to you this evening is, does Israel have the right to use any force under any circumstances against the people of Gaza? The intuitive response is to say, much as I don't want to have to admit it, of course they have that sacred, unassailable right to self-defense. But I will try to persuade you that the intuitive response, that right of self-defense, is in the circumstances of Gaza and comparable circumstances, that right does not exist. The current debate among human rights organizations and Israel's supporters generally comes down to the question, did Israeli snipers, or have Israeli snipers, resorted to excessive and disproportionate force against the demonstrators? That's the position of places like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the UN General Assembly. Israel has used excessive or disproportionate force, whereas Israel's supporters, they claim that Israel has used the amount of force necessary to prevent protesters from breaching the perimeter fence. So basically, the poles in the debate, the spectrum is disproportionate, excessive force versus necessary force as a right of self-defense, either of the snipers themselves or of the Israeli communities abutting the perimeter fence with Gaza. Now, you will notice that all the parties to the debate, they proceed from a common premise. The premise is that Israel does have a right to use force in order to prevent Gazans from breaching the fence. That's the common premise. The dispute comes down to this. Those who allege that Israel has used disproportionate or excessive force, the human rights organizations, they tacitly legitimize Israel's right to use proportionate or moderate force. You can't use disproportionate and excessive force, but that seems to suggest you do have the right to use proportionate or moderate force. But the fact is, Israel cannot claim a right to use any force in Gaza, whether it be moderate or excessive, whether it be proportionate or disproportionate, whether the protesters are armed or unarmed, and whether or not the protesters do or don't pose an imminent threat to life. It appears otherwise, but that's because the current debate in the mainstream, and including the human rights organizations, they ignore what international law actually has to say on the topic, and they abstract from the specific situation in Gaza. So, let's begin with the law. What does the law have to say about this right to self-defense and the right to use force? Let's start with the basics. The Palestinian people in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, they're struggling to realize their internationally validated right to self-determination, as the International Court of Justice ruled in 2004. Now, the law, as it's interpreted by the leading scholars in the field, they say that, according to the law, an occupying power, in this case Israel, an occupying power is not allowed to use force to suppress a popular insurrection in a self-determination struggle. An occupying power does not have, under international law, the right to use force to suppress a struggle for self-determination. The right to self-determination under international law is one of those basic rights. There are fancy terms for it for those who follow the scholarly literature. It's called the jus cogens right. That means there are no exceptions to this right. And so obviously, if that's the case, Israel cannot have the right to use force to deny the people of the occupied Palestinian territories of the right to use, deny their right to self-determination by using force. On the other hand, international law does not prohibit a people struggling for self-determination to use force in order to achieve their fundamental right. As it happens, the demonstrators in Gaza have chosen to use nonviolence in pursuit of their right to self-determination, but that's a politically prudent decision. Had they chosen to use force in order to achieve their right to self-determination, there's nothing in international law that says they can't use it. The only thing that international law does say categorically, without equivocation, is that an occupying power, in this case Israel, does not have the right to resort to military force. Now that, you will notice, is quite contrary to how the law is depicted when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Because it's typically said that Israel has the right to use violent force in self-defense against Gazans, whereas we're told that the people of Gaza and the West Bank are obliged to wage their struggle for self-determination non-violently. But that's an exact reversal of the law. The law says it's Israel that must use nonviolent means, whereas it's the Palestinians who, under international law, have the right to use force if they so choose. The UN Special Coordinator on the peace process, this kind of creepy guy, Nikolai Mladenov. So he writes in one of his recent reports, all factions in Gaza must refrain from illicit arms buildup and militant activity on the ground. Well, that's exactly wrong. The factions in Gaza are not under any legal obligation from arms buildup or militant activity on the ground. In fact, under international law, nothing bars a foreign power, in the case at hand, say the Islamic Republic of Iran, from providing the people of Gaza with weapons. There is absolutely nothing in international law that prohibits or bars that. Whereas Mladenov and his ilk say nothing about the obligation, which is real under international law, that Israel must refrain from its arm buildup and militant activity on the ground to suppress the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. Now, some of you who know the law are thinking, well, I think he's kind of misrepresenting the law, because Israel is, under international law, an occupying power, and one of the rights under the Fourth Geneva Convention, that is one of the rights that's accorded the occupying power, is the right to what's called maintain public order. And so, doesn't Israel have the right, as an occupying power, to maintain public order in the territories over which it exercises its occupation? But that's wrong on several counts. I'll just address two. Number one, the fundamental purpose of the Fourth Geneva Convention is not to endow occupiers with rights, but on the contrary, as the subtitle of the Fourth Geneva Convention says, its purpose is, and now I'm quoting the subtitle of the Fourth Geneva Convention, its purpose is the protection of civilian persons in time of war. Has Israel, as the occupying power, has it protected the civilian population in Gaza? Well, that to me is a fairly uncomplicated question. It's one of those questions that don't require an extensive application of your mental powers. Israel has subjected Gaza's civilian population to a protracted siege that amounts to illegal collective punishment. Gaza now has either reached the point or is approaching the point where it has become unlivable. Now, if instead of protecting civilians in time of war, you've created a nightmare situation in Gaza, such that the place already is, or is rapidly approaching, a state of unlivability, then you don't have the right to maintain order if the disorder is a consequence of you creating an unlivable situation in Gaza. You can't claim under the Fourth Geneva Convention the right to maintain order if you have not lived up to your responsibility of the protection of civilian persons, especially when the disorder is a consequence of the fact that you are strangulating the people of Gaza. Now, the second point to bear in mind on this question of whether Israel as an occupying power has the right to maintain public order is Israel would have that right if Israel's occupation of Gaza was legal, if it were legal. But Israel's occupation of Gaza at this point in time, in my opinion, has ceased to be a legal occupation for a very simple and I think transparent reason, which is the occupation, what makes an occupation under international law. There's one fundamental characteristic of an occupation, and that fundamental characteristic is it's supposed to be temporary. If it ceases to be temporary, it's no longer an occupation. So, who here is clever enough, apart from the young lady in the second row, who doesn't want to embarrass the rest of the audience by shouting out the answer? What do you call an occupation that doesn't end? Yes, it's an annexation. And I think it's reasonable to infer that after more than a half century, and inasmuch as none of the major political groupings in Israel is committed to ending its rule of Gaza, the reasonable inference, the reasonable conclusion is it's no longer an occupation. It's an annexation. You can either call it, you can denote it, an illegal occupation, the kind of occupation that existed from 1971 on in Namibia. The South African occupation of Namibia became, under the terms of the UN Security Council, International Court of Justice, and General Assembly, it officially became an illegal occupation, or you can call it an annexation. But you can't, in my opinion, any longer call it, because it's a distortion, a falsification of reality. You can't any longer call it an occupation, because, as I said, the fundamental premise of an occupation is it's supposed to end. And one of the preconditions of judging whether or not an occupation will or will not end, it's what the International Court of Justice in the case of Namibia referred to as good faith negotiations. You have to show, as the occupying power, that you are engaging in good faith negotiations to end that occupation. Well, in the case of Israel, there's no requirement of any deep-seated understanding of this so-called peace process, Israel has declared in all of its major political groupings it's not ending the occupation. So there are no good faith negotiations, and so I think it's correct to say it is an annexation. I don't want to go into that too much, but I would make the point that although it was a surprise that after Mr. Netanyahu's last electoral victory, the New York Times, in an editorial, lamented that Israel now seems well on its way to becoming something that many Jews who were supporters of Israel for so long must find morally very unpalatable, that Israel is going to be the only country on earth that legally resembles South Africa. I think the Times was mistaken on one point, and that's the question of timing. I'm not into slogans or throwing about epithets, but as a technical matter, for those of you who care about these terminologies, I think one can say soberly, rationally, without any hysteria or fanfare, that Israel now is an apartheid state because the territories have been de facto annexed. And so you have, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, a population of about 12 million. Of those 12 million, about 6.5 million have roughly the same rights as the white folks had in South Africa. You have another population, the Arab citizens of Israel, who have what you might call second-class status, I think pretty close to the Indian population inside South Africa during the apartheid era. And then you have approximately a little more than 4.5 million people who have no rights whatsoever. And that is, for those of you who care about the terminology, I myself am a little bit skeptical about its utility because most young people haven't a clue what apartheid was. So I'm not sure how much that term resonates for young people. Once I saw on British television a young woman, a leftist, on the same show as this character named Piers Morgan. Some of you know him from Britain's Got Talent. And he was accusing her of being pro-Obama. And she said, "I'm not a pro-Obama, you idiot. I'm a communist." And it was a funny sight to behold, because for the new generation, communist does not have the same resonances as it did for mine. You just didn't do that on television in my era. Nobody did that, you know. And so I'm not sure about the usefulness of this apartheid term, because after all, for those of you who are older in the room, and there are a number of you who are still contemplating whether or not the 60s are over, well, they are, but that's already, apartheid ended in 1989, 1990. So we're talking more than 2 decades ago. And so for young people, I'm not sure if the term has much resonance, but as a factual matter, as a legal matter, as a fact that apartheid is under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, it's a crime against humanity. As a technical legal matter, Israel is an apartheid state. De facto, because the territories have been annexed by Israel. So, having been annexed, the occupation now being illegal, they have no right to maintain order. They only have one right. As an occupying power, you have a right to stay. But once the occupation has become illegal, you have, just as the U.S. representative said in the United Nations when Namibia, its occupation was declared illegal, he said the occupying power has only one right, and that's to leave. They have no rights anymore except the right to pack up your bags and to go. That's the law. Let's try to think or look at it in a slightly less technical form, and let's see where we get if we don't look at it in terms of the Geneva Conventions and what legal experts have to say, but just to apply a little bit of common sense. There's a tenet of law that says no rights can be derived from illegal acts. If you've done something illegal, you can't claim after having committed that illegal act that you have a right. Now there is a Latin version of it, but I never had a very good command of languages by virtue of my accent, so I won't read it to you, especially because it's going to be awful Latin, and it's going to sound like Tallulah Bankhead. For those of you who know who she is, with the raspy voice, you do. Don't give away, don't be too proud of that, because you've just dated yourself you're well past 80. So, it's obvious, or ought to be obvious, that a right to self-defense does not obtain in all situations. So let's see, we're going to test the brain power of the People's Republic of Portland. So far, in terms of your artistic and literary achievements, I would say there's not much to write home about. But let's see sheer brain power. Who here can describe an act which, once committed, strips you of any subsequent acts or subsequent rights, for example, the right to self-defense? Okay, we have a young man sitting in the second row. He looks like if you were in the 1960s, you would clearly have been a flower child. I could see you in the song, "If you're going to San Francisco, make sure you have a flower in your hair." Do you know that song? 1 second. Wait 1 second, let me back up. Have you ever heard of San Francisco? Okay. Now,
I've heard of flowers too.
you've heard of flowers too. Put the two together and what do you get? Okay, give me an act which, once committed or having been committed, strips you of any right to self-defense.
A crime.
Well, give me an example. Can you be more concrete?
If you murder somebody.
Well, then we'll be a little bit late in the day. But you're on the right track. Give me a crime where the person against whom you're perpetrating the crime might use force And if that person used force against you, you can't claim a right to self-defense.
Right.
Exactly. The most obvious example is rape. If you attempt to rape a person and the person resists by pummeling you or biting you, you can't claim a right to self-defense against that person. Or as that simple legal principle says, no rights can be derived from illegal acts. Once you've committed that illegal act, you lose any claim to a right to self-defense. Or to take another example, a theater owner has no right to self-defense if patrons attack him after he sets the building ablaze and impedes their flight. Now, you may laugh, and you might think, well, that's obviously true. If it were opening night of The Wizard of Oz, and the theater owner has assembled a huge crowd waiting to hear Judy Garland sing Over the Rainbow, or Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, or any of those classics. And then the theater owner, who in another life, concealed from the public, is a pyromaniac. The crowd having been assembled, he takes out his cans of gasoline, circles the building, sets it afire, and then people come pouring out of the building. He's impeding their flight, blocking them. They are filled with rage, and they start beating him, and he says, "How dare you? I have a right to self-defense." And that's transparently ludicrous. You look like that theater owner. I'm just, you have that look, like I'm revealing a hidden chapter in your life. You sought refuge in Portland? Okay. And in my opinion, and we'll see whether or not you'll agree, Israel's conduct vis-a-vis Gaza falls into the same category of acts that render null and void the right to self-defense. If that were not true, if I were mistaken, then it would amount to the right of Israel to use military force in order to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal blockade. Now you have to ask yourself the question, does that make any sense? Can Israel have the right to use force in order to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal blockade? Because if you claim they have this right to self-defense, or as human rights organizations say, their right to use force if the people of Gaza present an imminent threat to their lives, either the lives of the snipers or the lives of the adjoining Jewish communities in the south of Israel, you're in effect saying that they have the right to use force to maintain an illegal occupation compounded by an illegal siege. Does that make sense? if it's nonetheless widely held that Israel has the right to use force to prevent Gazans from breaching the border fence, that's because most of these debates hinge on the technicalities of law that obscure the human stakes in what's going on in Gaza. So, let's start with the basics. What is Gaza? It's a narrow coastal strip. It's among the most densely populated areas on the planet. More than 70% of Gaza's population of 2 million, more than 70% are refugees. They're either those who were expelled in 1948. Can somebody help me with this phone because somebody is calling. So the person who lent me the phone, if you can just, thank you so much. It's from the MOSSAD.
That again, huh?
Okay.
There we go. You can just click it off at that.
Let me spell that out again. Because it has a familiar ring. It consists 70% of refugees, and half the population of Gaza consists of children. So when you see that young woman who prudently excused herself and is no longer amongst us, which I think was a very wise move, most of the people of Gaza look like her. They're children. So if there's anything you want to walk away with from tonight, it's to remember that all of the miseries being inflicted on that population, its miseries being inflicted not on Hamas, as the Israelis like to say. Well, that's how they talk. Kind of freakish, those people. It's not Hamas, it's children. More than half of Gaza's population comprises children. It's starting up again. This one is from Shin Bet. Is that? Can you figure out a way to disable it? Or is this all a Zionist trick?
They're claiming a right to rebuttal.
I'll work on it.
Okay.
There we go. Should be no more.
Okay, I heard that before.
For real.
For over a decade, Israel has placed this speck of land under a devastating siege. More than 50% of Gaza's workforce is now unemployed. It has the highest unemployment of anywhere on this planet. More than 50% live below the poverty line. 80% depend on international food aid. 97% of the water in Gaza is contaminated. For the first quarter of 2018, Gaza's economy registered a negative 6% growth. What's causing this humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza? It's no secret. You look at the reports of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, UNCTAD, the UN agency, or 10,000 other reports. I have never in my life seen so many reports devoted to Gaza's economy when Gaza has no economy. It's just kind of mind-boggling. I'm talking about thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of reports by all of these UN and NGO organizations on an economy that doesn't exist. But on one point, there is a consensus. What's causing this disaster? Is it, as we're often told, Hamas mismanagement? Is it the usual Arab corruption and incompetence? No, the explanation is pretty straightforward. It's the blockade. Israel doesn't let anything go in and doesn't let anything go out. So it ought not to come as a surprise that the economy has collapsed. That's Gaza. Now, we're told that what separates Gaza from Israel, we're told that this fence is a border, as if Gaza were a state. There's this border between two states, Gaza and Israel. But the distinguished Hebrew University professor Baruch Kimmerling, he called Gaza a concentration camp. As he put it, the biggest concentration camp ever. The former UK Prime Minister, the Conservative UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, he called Gaza an open-air prison. The Israeli newspaper, its most distinguished newspaper, Haaretz, called Gaza a ghetto. The Economist called it a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross, it called Gaza a sinking ship. The International Monetary Fund called it a humanitarian catastrophe. The UN Human Rights Chief called it a toxic slum in which an entire civilian population is caged from birth to death. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Gaza, he observed, "I see this extraordinarily inhuman and unjust process of strangling gradually 2 million civilians that really pose a threat to nobody." And then you have to ask the question to yourselves, does Israel have the right to use force to encage Gaza's 1 million children in a ghetto or a toxic slum? Don't the people of Gaza have the right to break free from a concentration camp? Does anyone now debate whether Germany used excessive or disproportionate force to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Who now ponders whether Germany had a right to self-defense against the Jewish fighting organization in the ghetto, which, unlike the people of Gaza, resisted with arms in hand? Are such questions even conceivable? Could anybody even think to ask the question whether the Nazi guards along the perimeter of the Warsaw Ghetto had the right to use force against the Jewish resistance? Do they have the right to use force even if there was an imminent threat to the lives of the guards. I dare say, without being too presumptuous, it's very hard for me to imagine that anyone in this room or any room of any sane assembly of people would say that the guards have a right to self-defense, or even if an imminent threat were posed to their lives. Now, some of you will recoil at the analogy, and you'll say, but Gaza is not the Warsaw Ghetto. But as an Israeli journalist who served in Gaza during the first Intifada, for those of you who don't remember, in 1987 to 91 roughly, there was an Israeli journalist named Ari Shavit. He served in Gaza during that period when Gaza was a much better place than it's become in the last couple of decades. He said at the time, the problem is not in the similarity between Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto. He said the problem is there isn't enough lack of similarity. There isn't enough lack of similarity. Experts predict that Gaza will soon be overrun by typhoid and cholera epidemics of the kind that Yemen has been experiencing, or like the epidemics that decimated the Jewish population in the Warsaw Ghetto. According to the RAND Corporation, already more than a quarter of all reported disease is caused by poor water quality and access. The poor water is the leading cause of childhood morbidity. The risk of an outbreak of a waterborne or other intestinal disease in Gaza is high. The World Health Organization said over 1 million people in the Gaza Strip are at risk of contracting waterborne diseases. There's a very decent person, some of you will know from her scholarly work, Sarah Roy at Harvard University. She's very smart and also very decent. Her parents were survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. Her father, and I'm not sure of her mother, I know her father, and probably I think her mother, were survivors of Auschwitz. And she's the world's leading scholar on Gaza's economy. And as I said, not only a first-rate scholar, but also just a really decent person who I happily can call a friend. And in the new edition of her standard work on Gaza's economy, she wrote, innocent human beings, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink and likely by the soil in which they plant. That being the case, the only morally sane question presented by the situation in Gaza, and I would say it ranks as a rhetorical question, the only sane question is, does Israel have the right, in the name of self-defense, to poison 1 million children? Does Israel have that right? I say it's a rhetorical question, which means at the end of the day, I don't think it's a very complicated question whether the guards along the perimeter of the Gaza ghetto have the right to use any force under any circumstances as a right of self-defense. Now, I'll just say a few words about the recent report that came out and that I mentioned, and then just say a few additional words on where I think things are now headed. It's ominous, but not terminal, in my view. The new human rights report on Gaza, I think, is the most authoritative, thorough, professional report that's ever been issued by a UN organization. In terms of its argumentative power, I would have to say it's superior to the Goldstone report, for those of you who remember it, an Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. A lot of it is very technical and bears on technical questions of law, which, unless they interest you, your eyes will begin to glaze over after page 100 of this 220-page single-spaced report. What makes the report, beyond its authoritativeness, its seriousness, its conscientiousness, and the fact that it just contained a whole lot of information which I was wholly unaware of about how this great march of return was organized. It's the first report by a major human rights organization that crossed a red line. The human rights organizations, here I'm speaking of the mainstream ones, whether it be Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and to a large extent even organizations for which I have a high regard like B'Tselem, under its current leadership, Haggai Elad. He's an absolutely terrific guy. He is really courageous, very smart. He's a physicist, a Harvard-trained physicist by profession. He now is the executive director of B'Tselem, and he's a mensch. Yes, he's a mensch. But all the human rights organizations have shied away from one allegation against Israel. Under international law, there are three basic classifications of illegal force. One, using what's called disproportionate force. That's the equivalent of taking a sledgehammer to kill a flea. Because when you take a sledgehammer to kill a flea, invariably there's going to be what's called collateral damage. That is to say, many innocents will end up getting killed as well. So that's called disproportionate force. When you use more force than is necessary to achieve what's called your military objective, and the course of using excessive force, you end up harming a large number of civilians, so what's called a disproportionate number of civilians. It's a technical term which, in my opinion, is utterly and completely worthless because it's impossible to calculate how many lives becomes excessive. So let's say you want to target a terrorist commander, and then you use, as Israel is its wont, it uses a 1-ton bomb. And the course of dropping this 1-ton bomb, it ends up killing 100 civilians. So then the question is, was that excessive force? A human rights organization will say that was excessive, but Israel will then say, number one, he was a terrorist commander who, according to our information, was about to carry out a terrorist attack. And anyhow, Israel will say, when we dropped the bomb on that building, we didn't know there were a lot of civilians in that building. It becomes unanswerable. You can't prove that you knew there were a lot of civilians in the building. And secondly, how many civilians killed becomes disproportionate. Is it 10? Is it 15? Is it 50? Is it 100? If you say he was about to carry out this massive terrorist attack, it's an unprovable claim, and it's absolutely worthless, in my opinion, as a matter of law and practicality. The second kind of force that's illegal under international law is called indiscriminate force. That is, you don't precisely target your military objective. It's as if somebody were to become right now in the room and want to get that woman sitting in the fourth row with a keffiyeh because they know her to be a terrorist commander, but rather than target her with the weapon, they just spray the room with bullets indiscriminately. And that becomes an indiscriminate use of force, and that too is illegal. If you look at the human rights reports, invariably, whenever Israel carries out, as is its wont, carries out these massacres in Gaza periodically, Israel is accused of using disproportionate force and indiscriminate force. The one charge that Israel is almost never accused of, it's that third category of illegal force, which all of you know, the intentional targeting of civilians. And this new human rights report on Gaza is the first one, to my knowledge, and I think I've read pretty much everything on the subject, that does forthrightly and unequivocally say what anyone who has been observing the conflict over a sustained period of time has to know. Israel is all the time targeting civilians, targeting children, targeting others. But here now, this UN report says, it concludes, the Commission, meaning the UN Commission, found that Israeli security forces used lethal force against children who did not pose an imminent threat of death or serious injury to soldiers. 4 of the children were shot as they walked or ran away from the fence. The Commission finds reasonable grounds to believe that snipers shot children intentionally, knowing that they were children. The Commission found reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers intentionally shot health workers despite seeing that they were clearly marked as such. The Commission found reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers shot journalists intentionally despite seeing that they were clearly marked as such. The Commission found Israeli security forces shot a number of male demonstrators in the lower abdomen and groin. The Commission found reasonable grounds to believe that the Israeli snipers shot disabled demonstrators intentionally, despite seeing that they had visible disabilities. And it goes on in that vein. Now, as I said, there's been a peculiar resistance, in particular by Jewish liberals. There's a kind of constitutional incapacity to absorb the fact that, yes, that goes on all the time. The 4 children who are playing hide and seek on the Gaza wharf, in front of scores of journalists in broad daylight, and the 4 children were killed, and you want to convince me that was unintentional? The reports by the human rights organizations, you take the case after Operation Cast Lead, the report by Human Rights Watch called Precisely Wrong, which was a report on Israel's use of drones during Operation Cast Lead, and it describes how these drones are guided towards the roof of a Gaza home. There are children playing on the roof. The camera technology is such that they can see clear as day that it's kids playing on the roof. The technology is such that up until the very last second, they're able to detour the rocket that they've fired. They do that all the time. But there's just this reluctance to believe that Jews kill children intentionally, but they do. With one caveat, and I don't make this as a joke, I can attempt humor. Most of the time it falls flat, and the other period of time it gets me in trouble with school administrators because what I say is politically incorrect, and proudly so, because I loathe political correctness. But I said I was going to make a caveat, or enter a caveat, and I'll enter it now, and I don't mean it as a joke. As you know, there has been an alignment of Israel with the alt-right around the world, whether it be Hungary, Poland, Modi's India, Bolsonaro's Brazil. Israel now is a full-fledged member of the reincarnation from the 1930s, the reincarnation of the global fascist movements. Now we have a global alt-right, a predictable response to the fact that there's been a huge political polarization because of the collapse in large parts of the world of the capitalist economy. And Israel is a bona fide member of that alt-right. The world's leading scholar on the subject of fascism is this fellow named Zev Sternhal. He's an Israeli historian. And a few months ago, he had an interesting commentary. He said the alt-right is comprised mostly of leaderships which are anti-Semitic. I don't think anti-Semitism is any longer the main preoccupation of these movements, but certainly it's an element of the alt-right. About that there can't be any doubt. It's an element. In some places, like in Hungary, it's more pronounced. In places like the US, in my opinion, it's pretty marginal. It's there, but it's pretty marginal. It's clear that Mr. Trump is trying to capitalize on hostility to Mexicans, obviously, playing on his immigration, his bases reasonable concerns about a loss of jobs and competition, job competition, and that the other main attack typified by Trump's current obsession with Ilhan Omar is with Muslims. So Jews don't figure prominently in Trump's agenda. In fact, it's very marginal, in my view, of our alt-right. But, it is an element. And Zev Sternhal, who's probably the world's leading authority on fascism, he did reflect on the question, how could these movements be making common cause with Israel? And his reply, I found, was both compelling and intriguing. He said, because these alt-right leaders and states, they don't see Israelis as Jews. They see Israelis as Israelis. For most of us in this room, I suspect, a Jew it conjures a certain image. In my era, it was, say, somebody who tended to be cerebral, tended to be aesthetic, tended to be physically feeble, weak. It would be somebody who looked like Franz Kafka with his big ears, or for my generation, a typical, stereotypical Jew would be someone like Woody Allen in terms of the image he projects. Cerebral, a little bit nerdy, and certainly not physically formidable. And that's not Israelis. It just is not. Now, I don't want to be contentious or gratuitously provocative, but in my view, they're not Jewish. The big mistake that people make here when they refuse to believe the Israelis are all the time killing children, whether it's in the streets of Hebron or along the perimeter in Gaza, is because they don't have a sufficient imagination to accept they are not Jewish. They're not Jewish in any meaningful sense as that term has been historically and sociologically defined. If you were able to internalize that fact, you wouldn't be at all surprised. They kill children like happens all over the place in this world. The one slight difference with Israel being that Israel is a citizen army. So when you're talking about child killers, regrettably, you're talking about everyone. Because they all put in that stint in the army. And when you're in that army, and either you're engaging as an occupier in the West Bank, or engaging in one of Israel's periodic massacres in Gaza, you're doing very ugly things. Now, some of you might be thinking, rightfully, well, didn't our soldiers do ugly things in Iraq, ugly things in Afghanistan? And if you reach back to my generation, supremely ugly things in Vietnam. That's all true. However, I don't say this in mitigation or extenuation. I say it simply as a factual matter. It still meant a relatively narrow slice of America. Because how many Americans actually served in Vietnam? No one of college age, or barely, I don't want to say no one, depending on your number in the draft. But very few people in college served in Vietnam. So you're talking about, people who committed terrible atrocities, but it was a very relatively narrow representation of America. Hey, in Israel, it's everybody. They all do those 4 or so years in their citizen army. They all humiliate and degrade aged Palestinians at the checkpoints. They all invade the homes at night and ransack the homes. And a large number carry out those monstrous massacres periodically inflicted on the hapless, God-forsaken people of Gaza. So that makes Israel slightly different than the atrocities committed elsewhere. But I would also say, and not at all facetiously, I don't think they're Jewish. And that's not a point of pride by me as a person who is of Jewish background. I just think it's a factual matter. I think the fascist alt-right is correct. It does not see Israelis as Jewish. It sees Israelis as Israelis. Obnoxious, loudmouth, racist, supremacist, xenophobic people. Like their leader. For the last 5 elections, they have chosen Mr. Netanyahu. Now, it is true, in part, they chose him because by the terms of Israeli society, he's been a very successful leader. The economy is booming. Israel has never had more open political alliances since 1967. Certainly, this is an unusually prosperous period for Israel economically and politically. So that would have been grounds to vote for Mr. Netanyahu. But there's another reason why they all vote for him. They look at him and they see themselves. He is us. He's a racist, he's a xenophobe, he's obnoxious, he's a Jewish supremacist. He thinks Jews are smarter than everybody else. He thinks not just Arabs and Muslims, he thinks everybody else is stupid. He comes barging into our U.S. Congress. Well, we do spend a lot of money on our Pentagon, on our CIA, on our security, security and intelligence apparatus. And this obnoxious, loudmouth, racist supremacist, he comes barging in because he has to tell us what is the real threat posed by Iran. As if without his Jewish genius we couldn't figure that one out on our own. We need him to tell us. So I personally find some comfort in the fact that these child killers have very little to do with me. I don't quite agree with my late mother, who could never quite grasp the Israeli type. She grew up in Warsaw. She was part of the Polish middle class, and she studied mathematics at Warsaw University, studied Latin, knew classical music quite well, and lived a very charmed life before the shadow descended upon her. She also had a slight, or more than slight, may she rest in peace, and she would throttle me for saying this, but she had a slight paranoid streak. And when she'd see the Israelis, which were as a physical type, so different than the Jews she knew, she said, they're not Jewish, they're all CIA. No. No, I'm not prepared to go there. But I think there's some truth in what she was trying to convey. This is not Jews as I know Jews. And now I'll just leave off where we stand now. I think there is a good chance you've all heard about Trump's deal of the century. And I think the likelihood is the deal of the century is going to go something like this. Gaza has reached a point of complete desperation. So one plank of the deal of the century will probably be a Saudi Arabian, Saudi-financed rehabilitation of Gaza and a partial lifting of the siege. The other side, the quid pro quo, is going to be Israel annexing the major settlement blocks. Not the whole of Gaza, because they don't want, it's not the whole of the West Bank, because they don't want the whole of the West Bank. They don't want Arabs. But they want the best land and water resources, and that's in the 10% of the West Bank on what's called the Israeli side of the wall they built. It's about 9.5% of the West Bank. And the quid pro quo is going to be, we will end the siege of Gaza, we will funnel money to rehabilitate it, and we're going to annex that 10% of the West Bank, which is where what are called the major settlement blocks are located. My guess is Hamas, which was left to its own devices because it got no solidarity from West Bank Palestinians, and the Palestinian Authority was working hand in glove with Israel to force Gaza to its knees because of all the betrayals and abandonments and the desperate situation of Gaza. They will probably go along with the deal, although never openly saying that they acquiesce in Israel's occupation of the West Bank, or Israel's annexation of 10% of the West Bank, the major settlement blocks. The Palestinian Authority will hem and haw and say, this is, Saeb Erekat, who is digit challenged in his IQ because it only has 2 digits, and neither of the figures exceeds the number 5. He will talk about this is the end of the 2-state solution, as he's been saying now for about 25 years, and they'll be completely ignored. Most of the liberal punditry in the United States, the commentariat, will go along with it because all of the liberal opinion has supported Israel's right as part of any final agreement to annex the settlement blocks. Whether you look at people like Martin Indyk, Dennis Ross, even Robert Malley, they've all talked about Israel's right to annex the settlement blocks. I think that it will be received positively as an act of statesmanship. They'll say, well, he did lift the blockade of Gaza, he meaning Netanyahu, and he had to do something to appease the right-wing factions in his coalition because politically he couldn't not do something, so he was compelled, he was forced, he was coerced into annexing the settlement blocks. That's how it will be played out. And then Israel will retain what's called its security border along the Jordan River, and the Palestinians that remain in the 90% of the West Bank, they will just be left to their own devices and quietly forgotten. There's only two flies in the ointment. Number one, if Bernie Sanders wins in 2020, which I consider to be a reasonable, though very far from certain prospect, if he wins, that will change all calculations. I think that it will release new forces in our body politic, and there will be real possibilities of influencing the political process, not just public opinion, where there has been major shifts, but also the political process in our Congress and elsewhere. So that's one change. And then there is the other change, which is the shifts in public opinion, such that large sectors of the Democratic Party have now grown steadily more alienated from Israel. And what used to be called a bipartisan issue is now rapidly becoming a partisan issue, with the Republican Party being the bastion of pro-Israel support, and the Democratic Party that will be close to, and there already is, a civil war in general, and in particular over the Palestine question. So that could change the calculus, but so long as Trump is in power, I think there will be a deal, and I do think Israel will get away with it because it will cast it in such a way as Mr. Trump is making Mr. Netanyahu is making a compromise, including ending the blockade of Gaza, and they will have the tacit support of Hamas if that happens. Hamas will kill me for saying this, but I will say it because I think it is accurate. I think they were placed in a completely untenable situation. They were completely abandoned, not just by the international solidarity movement, but by Palestinians in the West Bank. There was no support. And there's going to be a feeling now, well, nobody gave a darn about us, and therefore we will go ahead. So that's what I have to say. You listened quietly, patiently, respectfully. So now I'll hear from you. Thank you. Excuse me?
One of these mics is wireless for people who have questions. Do you want to call on people?
The easiest thing for questions is just make... excuse me.
Do we have this on?
No, it's dead.
Just for recording.
Just for recording? Okay, so we won't use this.
If
Never
you
mind, they didn't give
can,
us 2 mics.
just make a line here. It'll be more efficient if you have a question or a comment. Okay, so go ahead. If you can, speak in an angle, otherwise the people in the back won't hear you.
Yeah. My question was regarding to the Armenian genocide that is recognized in many places around the world, but it is often not recognized by Israel. Could you speak to why that is and why they still haven't chosen to recognize it?
Well, that's just realpolitik. They had for a long time an alliance with Turkey, and one of the prices of this alliance was not to talk about the Armenian genocide. But in more recent times, that's changed. I don't know what currently the official position of Israel is on the Armenian genocide, but there has been a mixture of a relationship with the Erdogan regime. In places like Syria, they work together. In places like Gaza, at least on the surface, there are elements of conflict which reached their peak in May 31st, 2010, with the Mavi Marmara assault. So, the agenda has many parts to it. Sometimes they collude, and sometimes they're in conflict.
Dr. Finkelstein, I have followed your writing for some years. I just want to thank you for the brilliant presentation you made tonight. Extraordinary from my point of view. And I thank you for your courage, your leadership, your contribution to public understanding. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words.
Norman, it's wonderful seeing you again. And by the way, I must give you a tour of Portland because I think the last time I saw you was in New York City. Portland has some beautiful things to offer. I'll be happy to take you on a personal tour.
I'm taking the plane out tonight.
You discussed a bit about the relation between the Israeli leadership and the alt-right. And that's something that I've been watching closely, and I took note of when Steve Bannon was welcomed to the World Zionist Organization and Conference. And I started to notice more of these similarities in comments by Richard Spencer admiring the Zionist state. And I started to come up with this term of, I guess, anti-Semitic Zionism, meaning they put the Zionism before the anti-Semitism. So long as they support the state of Israel, they're more than welcome. Could you comment on that?
Well, that's not unusual. You have to remember, not that it was a major aspect of his administration, but those of you whose memories go back to Richard Nixon, he was very well disposed towards Israel, but just as you might expect from a right-wing Republican, and right-wing Republican is a very different thing now than it was back then. I mean, people forget that Richard Nixon originated affirmative action. That policy began under his term of office, but for his day, he was considered a conservative Republican. If you look at, for example, Seymour Hersh's very excellent book back then, it was called Kissinger in the White House Years, The Price of Power. And Nixon harbored all sorts of anti-Semitic stereotypes, as you might expect, but he was also pro-Israel. So that kind of combination is not unusual. What is unusual is the alt-right is just a reconstitution of the fascist right from the 1930s. We don't yet have a substantial alt-left. In the 1930s, it was the communist socialist left, what was called the Popular Front in places like Spain and France. But we have the elements of it. For every Trump, there is a Bernie, there's a Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So you might say there is an incipient alt-left comparable to the communist socialist left of the 1930s. But Israel's open alignment with these gangster leaders, it is true here, I don't like cheap sloganeering, but it really is a gang of swaggering macho men, whether it's Modi, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Netanyahu, or the characters in Eastern Europe, these kinds of thuggish characters who derive a certain amount of pride from the knowledge that they regard the rule of law and what are called enlightened values or humanistic values as the worldview of pansies, and they are tough, ruthless men. Really, it's a very creepy picture, and Israel is part of it, for sure. And they get along famously. That is kind of new, I would say. You know, there's always been marginal elements among Jews who carried on that way. But as a more than a marginal phenomenon, not really. But that's, as I said, because in my view they're not Jewish. Whatever else they are.
Well, I want to thank you also for your excellent presentation and the work you've done. But some of your prognostications are pretty depressing. I just want to know how, as people who care, how can we help?
I'm not devoid of hope. I think we live now in. There's a lot of possibility now, and there's a lot of danger now. You know the cliche that the Chinese character for danger is also the Chinese character for possibility. And we have both right now. I think there's a realistic chance that Bernie Sanders will be elected president. That would be the most extraordinary event, certainly, in my lifetime as an American, were that to happen. And not just because he attended my high school, as did Charles Schumer, as did Judge Judy.
Is she from Portland?
No, you have Ernst luck. And that would really shake up things quite significantly. Say what you want about Bernie, but he's the real deal. The ruling elites know it. The Democratic Party knows it. And they're very worried about what's going to happen this time. And Bernie's fighting back early in the game, basically sending the signal to the Democratic Party, no dirty tricks this time because I'm going to call you out on them. And it's the same thing with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Now, there has been a very sinister alliance between the Jewish groups who are acting as Israeli agents in British society and British ruling elites who dread the prospect of a Corbyn victory, because Corbyn is the real deal. Bernie's basically Corbyn light. Yes, but it's not bad, because Corbyn's he's the real deal. He doesn't like the idea of homelessness in this world. He's not the kind of guy who thinks it's enough to put $1 in their cup on your way to the Hamptons. So, what you have in the UK is an unusual phenomenon. Because historically the Jewish groups, the mainstream Jewish groups, they played the anti-Semitism card every time Israel faced a public relations debacle for one of its periodic massacres. And they would start charging all the critics of being anti-Semitic, which is a familiar and old tune. However, now, in the case of Corbyn, the British ruling elites decided, let's join in with these Jewish groups who are acting at Israel's behest, but let's use that charge to try to discredit Corbyn so that he won't get elected, not because they care about Israel, but because they care about preserving a status quo from which they've benefited. And so now, across the board, it's a really astonishing thing to observe from afar, as I have closely. From the Guardian newspaper on the so-called left to the Daily Mail on the so-called right, and everything in between, BBC, Sky News, The Times, they're all claiming that Jeremy Corbyn is a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Semite, and that anti-Semitism has been institutionalized in the Labor Party. That's the term they use. It's been institutionalized. If you look at the most recent polls, 2/3 of British polled think Corbyn now is an anti-Semite, which is kind of loony if you know who he is and what he stands for. And it's almost certain, well, first of all, so far it appears it hasn't had much of an effect on likely voters in an election, because the attitude is, well, maybe he's an anti-Semite, but really who cares, because we care about those economic issues, which is what he's talking about. So they accept that he might be or is, but they don't really, it's not going to change their vote. And what's happening in the UK is basically a dress rehearsal for what's going to happen here. Now, of course, it's going to be difficult to make the charge of anti-Semite stick on Bernie Sanders for a number of reasons, which most of you seem to have an intuitive grasp of, not least his Brooklyn Jewish accent. However, he is surrounded by a lot of people on whom that charge will stick. Right now in the UK, the Labour Party, in order to deflect the allegation of anti-Semitism, has been carrying on all these purges of alleged anti-Semites in the party, many of whom I know by reputation, and the allegations are completely nuts. But the Labour Party, in my opinion, stupidly believing you can appease these forces, and stupidly believing it has anything to do with anti-Semitism, has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The case of the Jewish organizations, it's Israel, it's not anti-Semitism. And the case of British elites, it's holding on to a status quo from which they've benefited. In the US, it's interesting to watch. It's interesting to watch because it's the prelude to what's going to come next year. How Bernie is reacting to Ilhan Omar, because they're waiting to see if he distances himself publicly from her. They know he will start carrying on the same purges as are going on in the Labour Party in the UK, and his campaign will be destroyed from within. Because they'll find Ilhan Omar type remarks in 10,000 people surrounding Bernie's campaign. And so far, to my surprise, I might say, he's been supporting her. And that's a good sign, that he's not going to let them use the anti-Semitism charge to wreck his campaign, as is now being used in the British case in an attempt to wreck Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. But it will come. There was just a report yesterday that AIPAC had these advertisements in Facebook attacking Bernie for his statements on Israel, or alleged statements on Israel. Now, as I said, I don't think it's going to be easy to make them stick with him, but it's going to be a problem with a lot of people around him. And we're going to have to wait and see how he handles it. And hopefully people like Ilhan Omar and AOC will figure out a way how to be principled on the one hand, but not hand anything to these thugs and machinators, anything to them that will make it easy for them to discredit Bernie's supporters and will force him to publicly distance himself, which I think will be a complete disaster. So far, so good. But it's going to be a tough battle. And if you have any curiosity about how it will play out, just take a gander across the pond and watch what they've been doing to Corbyn. It's been nonstop. Last summer, for 3 months, non-stop. Every newspaper, every news program was just the the Jeremy anti-Semitism thing. Yes.
I wonder if you have any hope for some change within Israel. I think most people outside of Israel feel that the long-term solution is one state with equal rights for everyone, and it would seem like there would be at least some people within Israel who see making a case with the Palestinians for such a state in a way that they would finally find real security and a real...
No, it's not going to happen. If you want to understand Israeli society, just look at the American South on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. Look at South Africa during the apartheid years. These people are very dug in. They're very self-righteous. They're very racist. And they don't pay any price. Why should they change? Most of you know the famous quote from Frederick Douglass: power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, it never will. Israel doesn't face any consequences whatsoever for the way it carries on. So it's not going to change any more than the American South would have changed merely as the result of white Southern, a sudden epiphany of enlightenment, revelation, and humanity. And if you think Israel is any different than places like Mississippi and Alabama during that era, I think you're off base. It's a very ugly place. I don't say that happily. I don't say it gleefully. I just think it's a fact. Yes. Mm-hmm.
In the early part of your remarks, you were talking about how shocked you were that there wasn't more of a global solidarity response to the uprisings by the Palestinians, and I'm wondering if you could give some really specific elaboration as to what you expected or what would be required, because clearly just a bunch of people demonstrating and rallying in front of Israeli embassies is not going to do it. It has to be much more.
Yes, but I'm old enough to remember the reaction to the first Intifada between 1987, December 7th, 1987, and 1991, after the end of the first Gulf War. It mobilized large numbers of people here in support of the Palestinians.
Doing what?
The things that people always do: demonstrations, civil disobedience, public forums, the sort of stuff you expect. Nothing happened here. Do you know, to my knowledge, in New York City, there was only one demonstration after the massacre on May 14th of last year. That was it. I think that there have been major errors of strategy and tactics and a kind of obsessiveness about this thing called BDS, when there was a real moment of reckoning for the people of Gaza, a moment of desperation and hopelessness, where it was clearly our duty, responsibility, and obligation to manifest solidarity as they engaged in mass nonviolent civil resistance and were being mowed down every Friday.
So do you have conversations with Jewish Voice for Peace leadership in the U.S.?
No.
Or other groups?
No.
To try to have those conversations?
No, I've talked about it, but I can't say I've had conversations with them about it. That would be inaccurate for various reasons, which I don't really care to talk about right now. But I think it was a wholesale abdication of responsibility. Yes.
I heard someone say, I can't remember when, a few years ago, that they felt that if the U.S. would end their support militarily for Israel, that it would end immediately. Is that naive? Or
No, I think, look, Israel is trying to diversify its diplomatic portfolio now. So it's trying to create alliances with China, with India, with the Gulf states, even places like Brazil. But at the end of the day, they depend on that U.S. support. And if they felt there was a realistic possibility that the U.S. would take a much more aggressive stand, there would be reverberations inside Israel. And that's why I think there is a possibility that if Bernie gets elected and there's mass civil resistance throughout the occupied territories, that Bernie will not follow the cues from Tel Aviv. How far he'll go, it's hard to say, because clearly Bernie's agenda is domestic. He will do or die politically on whether he can turn around the economy in a significant way. His is not an international agenda. He's kind of weak on international issues in general. Some of you may recall that when he ran the first time, he was calling for Saudi Arabia to accept more of its regional responsibilities. But he's obviously turned around because he was behind the legislation to end U.S. support for the Saudi murder in Yemen. But in general, he's kind of weak. I'm not so troubled by that, because if he can turn around with mass support our system domestically, it'll have its reverberations elsewhere. So, yes, I do think if the U.S. were to change its position, it would have reverberations inside of Israel. Yes? Okay.
I'm curious what connection you would draw, if any, between indigenous reservations on U.S. soil or on this land and between the occupation with Gaza.
I'm not sure if the occupation with Gaza works, but as a general principle, the dispossession and displacement of the native population became pretty close. I once wrote on the subject a long time ago, trying to make a systematic comparison between the fate of the Native Americans, in particular the Cherokee Indians, and the fate of the Palestinians. And reading through the scholarly literature, I was quite surprised at how effective the comparison was. And so I think one of the most effective ways of trying to speak to an American audience about the situation there, an audience which is not fully knowledgeable about the facts, is to say that what happened to the Native Americans is roughly equivalent. There being some differences, of course, with what happened to the Palestinians. Yes, I'm going to be politically correct by calling on women as opposed to men because he's a dead white male.
Sorry, I was going to ask.
Was that your daughter?
Who? Oh, no. Yeah, I just let my child run.
I knew she would walk out on me. I was just wondering when.
No. I was going to ask. So I'm fairly new to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm sorry if the question has a glaring answer that I've grossly overlooked. But recently, when it came to Netanyahu's campaign to be, which ended up being reelected, one of his promises, if I'm correct, was that he was going to annex more land.
Yes.
And so my question would be regarding that, one, since you have more insight in Israel and politics and how they operate, but what do you think the likelihood, one, of Netanyahu doing that and doing so successfully, and second, what would be, or what should be, I suppose, which you kind of answered already, sorry, I'm rambling, that the reaction from the Palestinians should be, and the international community at large. That seems to me quite blatantly an illegal move to do.
Well, as I said during my remarks, I do think it'll happen. I think it's quite likely. I think most of the liberal opinion here will support it. The international community will not. Just as after Trump recognized the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem, the EU said, no way, Jerusalem is still occupied Palestinian territory. So I don't think there'll be any international validation of it. I don't think it'll change very much, to tell you the truth, because Trump doesn't carry much moral authority. So his recognition will die when his term of office ends. So I don't think it'll have much practical result. And I think it all will then depend on the Palestinians, who, there's a reasonable possibility they'll end up like the Native Americans. Is that a certainty? No. But we shouldn't kid ourselves either. There has been a pretty aggressive process, a kind of a juggernaut, and the Palestinians have not been able successfully to resist it, let alone stop it dead in its tracks. And it may continue till the end. Yes. Okay, the last question goes to the hippie.
I'm wondering, what do you see as both the real maxim behind Israel's just lunacy surrounding the possibility of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and also, well, not just, on the part of the West trying to prevent it, but also on the part of Israel trying to prevent any diplomatic...
Well, that's a reasonable question. I think the answer is straightforward. If Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, it would have a serious deterrent power. And if it had a serious deterrent power, Israel couldn't carry on the way it does in the region. Why doesn't Israel take out Hezbollah the way it takes out the Gazans periodically? Very simple reason. They know Hezbollah is a serious force to reckon with, and they may have real problems if they attack it.
Do you think that Netanyahu really believed that the Iran deal would somehow be conducive to Iraq getting a nuclear weapon, or do you think there's another component to him also opposing diplomatic effort?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I don't think he feared Iran would get the weapon. I think what he feared was that there would be a kind of normalization of relations between Iran and the West, and that Iran would become an acknowledged regional power, which would diminish Israel's domination and terrorization of the region. And that was his main concern. Not that Iran would acquire a nuclear weapon, but that Iran would take the place that is owed to it by its geography, its demography, its history, its culture, and all the rest. It's it's an impressive place. You can't get around that. And one of the interesting things about Iran, for those of you who are women, is there's a kind of set belief in the West about women's in relative deficiency when it comes to performance in mathematics. When actually there's a larger number of females in higher mathematics, pursuing higher mathematics degrees in Iran as against males. And as some of you will recall, the highest honor in the field of math is the Fields Medal. And the first woman to earn it a few years ago was an Iranian woman. She very lamentably died prematurely of breast cancer. But it's an interesting fact. It's been my experience, one of the unusual things about Muslim Arab women is they perform much better in math than non-Muslim Arab women. If you ever talked to anyone here, Muslim Arab woman, I have never met any Muslim Arab woman who felt any fear of math. They're perfectly confident in it. And I often ask, well, how do you feel in your classes with all the male? Nothing. And I have my own theory about that. My theory is, it's the Muslim fathers. Because they tell their daughters, I don't care if you're a girl or a boy, you're going to be a civil engineer. It's just as simple as that. You're going to be a civil engineer, case closed, and you have to know the math. No, I do actually believe that. And so they have the reassurance of their fathers that they have every bit as much ability in math as boys do. But in general, Iran is an impressive, obviously a very impressive culture and civilization. And there is a fear that it will take its, so to speak, rightful place in the region. It has its share of craziness there, for sure. I'll just tell you one of my favorite stories, and I'm going to leave it at that because my voice is gone, as you've noticed. A couple of years ago, I went on a speaking tour in Iran, and I was sponsored by the Ahmadinejad faction. Not my choice, but that's who I got. So they take me to the third most holy city. It begins with an M. What is it? Mashhad. They took me to Mashhad. And I had a town meeting in Mashhad. It was about 500 people. And all they wanted to do ask me questions about the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust. I finally said, my God, who would have thought that you have something in common with the Israelis? And they were all shocked. What was that? I said, you and the Israelis are absolutely obsessed with the Holocaust. And I just got so fed up. I said, folks, it happened. It was horrible. But you had nothing to do with it, so let's just move on. And then they start to shout that I was a CIA agent. But that's not my favorite story. I went to teach at a university which channels most of its graduates into the bureaucracy. It was a religious university in Tehran, but I forgot its name now. And the rector of the university, absolutely delightful guy. If you're ever in Iran, wherever you go, whatever you do, they give you a gift. You always have a gift. And 99 times out of 100, it's the same gift. It's pistachio nuts. And by the end, I had enough pistachio nuts to feed everybody in China. Not that I'm complaining. But this fellow, he wanted to give me another gift. And he was very cheerful. He had an impish smile and a hearty laugh. And he handed me the shopping bag and he said, "Here's your gift." And I said, "I know you're going to like it." He said, "I know you're going to like it. I know you're going to like it." And I reach in and I pull it out. It's a 2-volume set. Denying the Holocaust, volumes 1 and 2. I mentioned this to some people. They said, "Leave it in your hotel room because you're going to have problems at the airport." So it has its share of lunacy, but the Israeli fear is that they'll have a regional challenger, and so they were fearful that what was called the 5+1 agreement between the 5 Security Council members and Germany on the one side and Iran was the first step towards a normalization, which would have meant an acceptance of Iran as a regional power, and that Israel cannot accept. It has to be in charge, in total charge. Okay, folks, parting is such sweet sorrow, so thank you.